All right, welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. For this one, you've sent in some pretty fascinating stuff. A lot of it, seems to be revolving around this core question of why do things happen the way they do?
Yeah.
And, it's a question that's, kind of plagued thinkers and philosophers and, people from, all walks of life for centuries. And it seems like there's this sort of underlying principle that, is at play that maybe if we can understand that, we can get a little bit of a better grasp on, why things are the way they are.
Right. And I think when you start to understand this principle, it's not just an intellectual exercise. It really does start to give you a new lens
Mm.
through which you can look at your own experience and kind of see the patterns that are maybe invisible at first glance.
Yeah.
It's really about going beyond just accepting things at face value and saying, okay, this happened, but why did it happen?
Yeah. And that principle we're going to look at today, this kind of, bedrock principle, is this idea of cause and effect.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty simple concept, on the surface. Every cause has its effect, every effect has its cause. But when you really start to unpack that, it has some pretty big ramifications for, the way we think about how the world works.
Yeah. And it even changes the way we use language, right?
Yeah.
Because we often say things like, oh, that happened by chance. But, what our sources are suggesting is that chance is not an independent thing in and of itself.
Mm.
It's just sort of a catch-all term for those causes that are either too complex for us to understand or that we haven't discovered yet.
Right. So it's not like, this sort of force of chance is floating out there. It's
Right.
more like we just don't know what the cause is yet.
It's our ignorance, not an actual force.
Exactly, exactly. So if we were to take like a classic example of chance, the coin flip, we say, oh, it's 50-50. It's a chance whether it's going to be heads or tails. But if we could precisely measure the force of your thumb as it, flicks
Oh,
the
wow.
coin up, the initial position of the coin, the air currents in the room, all these different factors, like all of those things are contributing to the outcome. It's just that it's incredibly difficult to measure those things.
Yeah.
So our goal today, the thing we really want to dig into with you is, this principle of cause and effect. And I think, the thing that I really want to bring to the listener is, to provide you with a way of thinking about this that you can use in your daily life. Because, when you start to understand this principle, it can be really empowering. It can give you a sense of control over your life. And it can also, provide a lot of insight into, why things happen the way they do. So let's start maybe by defining this a little bit more fully.
Sure. One of the sources that you share, the Kybalion, has a pretty comprehensive statement. It says, every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to law. Chance is but a name for law not recognized. There are many planes of causation, but nothing escapes the law. And so I think, when you look at that statement, there's a few layers there that are worth unpacking. First of all, just the universality of it.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing escapes this law. Everything happens according to this principle. And second is that idea that chance is just a law that we haven't figured out yet. And third, it alludes to different planes of causation, which maybe we can touch on briefly. So it's suggesting that cause and effect doesn't just operate on the physical level, but on multiple levels. It operates on the mental level, the spiritual level, and that the higher planes can influence the lower planes.
Okay, yeah.
So, for instance, a thought which would be on the mental plane can be the cause that leads to an action, which is on the physical plane, which then creates effects in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting concept that, this isn't just about things happening on the physical plane.
Right.
That our thoughts and our emotions can actually have, a causal effect on, the things that happen in the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, another thing that's really important to keep in mind is that, this idea of cause and effect, it's not about one static thing creating another static thing. Our sources really emphasize that it's about events.
Mm-hmm.
It's about this constant flow of happenings. Think of it like this kind of vast, you know, interconnected web where, one thing leads to another,
Yeah.
and it's all kind of ultimately flowing from, some kind of, prime mover,
Yeah.
some kind of creative energy that's the ultimate source of all of these happenings. So it's not like, one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball.
Right.
It's this constant flow of events.
Yeah. And maybe a good example of that is, you can think about, if a vase were to fall off of a table and break, the obvious cause would be that it was knocked off the table. But then you can say, well, why was it knocked off the table?
Right.
Maybe it was knocked off the table because, there was a gust of wind that came through the window. But then why was there a gust of wind? Well, maybe the window was open and there was a change in atmospheric pressure. And, why was there a change in atmospheric pressure? Well, maybe there's a storm system moving in.
Mm.
And so you can keep tracing those causes back further and further and further. And, ultimately, you could even say that, the sun is the ultimate cause of all of these things because the sun is what drives the weather patterns.
Right.
So it's really this interconnected web, and it's not just about a simple linear chain of events.
Yeah, and the example in the material about the speck of soot, I think it's such a, great image, for this idea of interconnectedness. So just this tiny speck of soot, right, floating in the air. And it has a history that stretches back, to ancient plant life, to geological processes that formed coal, and then to the combustion that released that particle into the air. But the chain doesn't end there.
Right.
That speck of soot, the fact that it, went on its particular journey, the fact that, it happened to catch your eye, it could influence your thoughts. It could lead you to, choose to share this material with us,
Yeah.
which then leads to this episode, which leads to the thoughts that it sparks in your mind and the thoughts it sparks in other people's minds.
Right.
So it's like, it really brings to life this idea that, as it says in the material, there's no small in the mind that causeth all.
It really makes you think about how, even just like the smallest, seemingly insignificant interaction that we have or choice that we make could have these really far-reaching consequences that we can't even imagine. Like think about, a random encounter you had with someone years ago that maybe fundamentally changed the direction of your life. That initial meeting, it seemed random at the time, but it set into motion this whole series of causes and effects that led to where you are today.
Right, right. And, speaking of, these sort of larger, kind of consequences, I think it makes sense to talk about a couple of, pretty important concepts that our sources touch on in relation to cause and effect, and that's karma and personal responsibility.
Yeah.
What do you see as the connection there?
Well, I think, at its core, karma is really just the principle of cause and effect applied to our own actions and intentions, and even our thoughts. It's the understanding that what we put out into the universe, whether it's actions, thoughts, emotions, it's all going to come back to us in some form as an effect. And then personal responsibility is recognizing that and taking ownership of that. It's about realizing that we're not just passive recipients of, fate or whatever you want to call it, but that we are actually active agents in creating the effects that we experience in our lives.
Okay, so it's not just about, taking responsibility when we make a mistake or something like that.
Right.
It's more about understanding that our choices have consequences.
Yeah.
That, our intentions have consequences, and that we can actually, use this understanding to, to improve our lives, right?
Yeah.
To
Right.
create more positive effects, to, to be more mindful of, the karma that we're putting out there.
Exactly. It's realizing that, your current circumstances, they're not just random. They're the result of past causes. Some of those causes you set into motion, some of them were set into motion by other people. But once you understand that, you actually have the power to start setting new causes into motion that will lead to different effects in the future. And it's not so much about, a cosmic judgment system or anything like that, but really just that the mechanics of the universe, are such that what you put out is going to come back to you in some way.
Right, right. Okay, so this is all very interesting and philosophical, but, how can our listeners, how can you listening right now actually use this principle of cause and effect in a practical way? How can you take this knowledge and apply it to your life to get more of what you want and to, to make your life better?
Well, I think the first key is just to become a really good observer of the causes behind the effects that you're experiencing in your life. When you notice a pattern or a situation that you're not happy with, you want to start asking why. What are the causes that are contributing to this outcome?
Okay, and our sources give us this really useful step-by-step process for sort of mapping, from an effect back to a root cause.
Yeah.
So let's walk through that a little bit.
Yeah, let's do it.
So the first step is just to take a moment and reflect on your life. And just think about, is there a particular outcome or a situation that you want to understand better?
Right.
This could be, a challenge that you're facing, a goal that you haven't been able to achieve, a recurring pattern of behavior.
Yeah.
Anything like that.
Yeah. Or it could even be something positive.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something that's going really well in your life and you want to understand what are the causes that are leading to that so you can do more of that.
Right. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So once you've got that effect in mind, the next step is to define it clearly and specifically.
Mhm.
So instead of just saying, I'm unhappy or I'm stressed, you would say, I consistently feel drained of energy by midday. Right.
Yeah. The more specific you can be, the better.
Yeah.
Because if you're just vague, you're not going to be able to, really trace it back to the root cause.
Right.
And it's tempting to just stay vague. But the more specific you get, the more you can actually start to see the patterns.
Right. Right. Okay, so then once you've defined the effect, really clearly, then you want to start exploring the potential causes.
Yeah.
And this involves asking yourself, why? Over and over again, right?
Yeah.
Peeling back the layers,
Yeah.
looking at it from different perspectives.
Right.
So, you want to think about your routines, your relationships, your environment, your beliefs,
Right.
all of these different things, and see how they might be contributing to the effect that you're experiencing.
Right. And this is the stage where, self-honesty is really crucial. Because a lot of times our first explanation for things is kind of superficial,
Yeah.
and it doesn't really get to the root of the problem. So if you are, tired every day by midday, your first thought might be, well, I'm just not a morning person.
Right.
But if you keep asking why,
Yeah.
maybe you'll realize, well, I'm not getting enough sleep or not eating a good breakfast.
Right.
There might be something deeper there
Yeah.
than just, I'm not a morning person.
And that can be hard. Right.
Oh, yeah. It's much easier to blame external factors
Right.
than it is to look at ourselves and say, okay, maybe I'm contributing to this problem.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
But that's where the real power comes from.
Okay, so once you think you've identified the root cause,
Mm-hmm.
what's the next step?
The next step is to create a plan to address that cause.
Okay.
So, this might involve learning a new skill, changing a habit,
Mm-hmm.
getting support from someone. But the key is to have a plan. Because if you don't have a plan, you're just going to keep doing the same things
Right.
and expecting different results.
Right. And that brings to mind that famous quote,
Yeah.
the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over
Exactly.
and expecting a different result.
You really have to have that plan.
Mm.
And it's important to remember that it's not a one-and-done thing. You have to monitor your progress
Mm-hmm.
and be willing to adjust the plan as you go
Okay.
because things change.
Right.
You learn new information.
Yeah.
And you have to be flexible.
So let's maybe look at a concrete example of how this might work.
Sure.
So the example in the material, feeling overwhelmed at work.
Yes.
So let's say that you're experiencing this, right?
Right.
You're feeling overwhelmed by your workload on a daily basis.
Mhm.
And this is leading to stress. It's leading to decreased productivity.
Yeah.
All the things that come with being overwhelmed. So if you were to use this process, to try to get to the root cause of this, what might be some of the questions that you would ask yourself?
Well, you could start by asking, is my workload genuinely too much?
Okay.
Is there objectively too much work for me to handle? Or am I just not managing my time effectively?
Mm.
Am I procrastinating? Am I taking on too many unnecessary tasks?
Right.
Am I struggling with delegation?
Okay.
Are there things that I could be giving to other people to do, but I'm not for some reason?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And if you dig a little bit deeper, you might find that the root cause is something like, I have trouble prioritizing tasks. Or, I take on more responsibility than I can handle
Mm-hmm.
because I'm afraid of disappointing others. Or maybe I'm afraid of appearing incapable, like there might be some deeper psychological reason why you're taking on too much.
Yeah. Or maybe it's a combination of factors, right?
Right.
It's not always just one thing.
Right. And then once you've identified that root cause,
Mm-hmm.
then you can create a plan to address it.
Right.
So in this example, maybe the plan would be to learn and implement some effective prioritization techniques, develop some assertive communication skills so that you can set boundaries and, say no to things that you don't have time for.
Right.
And, maybe learn to delegate tasks effectively,
Yeah.
so that you're not trying to do everything yourself.
And the beauty of that is that you've gone from this vague sense of overwhelm
Right.
to, okay, here's the cause.
Mm.
Here's what I can do about it.
Yeah.
It's empowering. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about, how this principle can apply to, kind of specific situations in your life.
Mhm.
But let's zoom out a little bit and talk about how this principle, really profoundly influences some of the, some of the big areas of our lives.
Yeah.
Starting with, our habits. Yeah.
Yeah, our daily habits. When you understand this principle, it really changes the way you approach habit formation because you start to realize that all of these little actions that you take every day, they're not just isolated incidents. They're actually setting off these chains of consequences.
Okay.
And so when you start to see that, it creates a sense of accountability. If you notice that a certain habit is consistently leading to a negative outcome,
Mm-hmm.
you're much more likely to be motivated to change that habit.
Right, because you can see the direct link,
Yeah.
between the cause, which is the habit, and the effect, which
Right.
is the negative outcome, and vice versa.
Yeah.
If you see that a certain habit is consistently leading to positive outcome,
Yeah.
you're going to be more likely to stick with that habit.
And, not only can you look at your existing habits and kind of see what they're creating,
Right.
but you can also use this understanding to make better decisions about new habits that you want to form.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you think about it, before you adopt a new habit, you can ask yourself, okay, what are the likely effects of this habit?
Right.
What are the good things? What are the bad things that could happen as a result of this habit?
Right.
And then you can make a more informed decision about whether or not it's a habit that you actually want to adopt.
Yeah, so like if you're thinking about starting a new exercise routine,
Right.
you can think about the effects. Okay, this is going to make me feel more energetic. It's going to improve my mood.
Yeah.
It's going to improve my physical health. And that can be a really motivating factor, when you're first starting out. And when it's hard, to stick with that new routine.
Right. And I think it also helps to understand that you don't have to make huge changes all at once.
Right.
Small changes can make a big difference over time because it's really about the consistency. It's about those small actions repeated over and over, and that creates a compounding effect.
And, all of this, ties into this concept of the habit loop, right? This idea that there's a cue, there's a craving, there's a response, and then there's a reward. So by understanding this principle, you can actually, become more mindful of the causes of your habits and the effects of your habits. And you can start to, to change those habits in a more conscious way. So I think that's a really powerful application of this principle.
Yeah, it's really about becoming aware of that
Well, yeah.
cause and effect sequence that's happening within your own mind and body.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to another really important area of life, and that's mental health. Our sources talk a lot about how understanding this principle can be really transformative for our mental and emotional well-being. And one of the key points that they make is that, when we understand the root causes of our mental health challenges, that's when we can start to make real and lasting improvements.
Yeah.
So instead of just trying to treat the symptoms,
Right.
with medication or therapy or whatever it might be,
Right.
we can actually start to address the underlying issue.
Exactly. If you are struggling with anxiety, for example,
Right.
if you can understand the root cause of that anxiety, maybe it's work stress, maybe it's relationship problems, maybe it's, poor sleep habits or something like that. Once you understand that root cause, you can actually start to do something about it.
Right.
You can start to develop strategies to address those issues.
And that can be really empowering.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Because, if you just think that your anxiety is this random thing that happens to you,
Right.
then you feel like you have no control over it.
Yeah.
But when you realize that there's actually a cause for it,
Mhm.
and you can actually address that cause, then you start to feel like you have agency. You
Right.
start to feel like you have some power over your own mental health.
Yeah. And that's so important for, for anyone who's struggling with any kind of, mental health challenge,
Right.
to know that you're not just, a victim of circumstance,
Right.
but that you can actually take steps to improve your situation.
Right.
And it's not just about, the internal factors either, right? Our sources talk about how, our external environment, things like our relationships, our lifestyle choices, our diet, all of these things can have a huge impact on our mental health.
Yeah. And so when you start to see that, you realize that you can make choices to support your mental well-being. You can nurture positive relationships. You can make healthy lifestyle choices. And those things can actually make a big difference.
Right.
It's not just about what's happening in your head. It's about the environment that you're creating for yourself.
Yeah.
And in terms of stress specifically,
Mhm.
Understanding the causes of your stress can help you to develop really effective coping mechanisms. So if you can identify the things that are triggering your stress, maybe it's, poor time management skills. Maybe it's, setting unrealistic expectations for yourself, or maybe it's a lack of boundaries. Once you know what those triggers are, then you can start to develop strategies to manage them. Things like mindfulness, meditation, learning to say no.
Right.
All of these things can be really helpful in reducing stress.
Yeah, it's about addressing the cause
Yeah,
rather than just trying to manage the symptoms.
exactly.
Okay, so, so far we've talked about, how most people kind of experience this principle, how
Mhm.
most people, are kind of at the effect of things, they're reacting to circumstances.
Yeah.
But our sources also introduce this really interesting concept of the master's perspective.
Oh, hey.
And this is the idea that there are people who have a deeper understanding of this principle and who are able to use it to actually shape their reality.
Yeah, and, they're not breaking the laws of the universe or anything like that,
Right.
but they're just operating at a higher level of understanding.
Right.
And so they're able to use those laws to their advantage.
So what do you think are some of the hallmarks of this, so-called master's perspective?
Well, the source material talks about how these masters have learned to control their wants and pleases
Uh-huh.
rather than being controlled by them. They've developed a will to will,
Yeah.
which means that they're able to choose their motivations and their intentions. They're not just reacting to their desires, they're actually in control of their desires.
Okay. So it's like the difference between, being a pawn who's moved around by external forces and being a mover,
Yeah,
someone who understands the rules of the game and can actually make strategic moves.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, the key difference is that the pawn is reacting to things that are happening to them,
Right.
whereas the mover is actually initiating actions. They're becoming a cause
Right.
rather than just being an effect.
And, I think it's important to point out that these masters, they're not somehow exempt from the principle of cause and effect.
Right.
They still have to operate within the laws of the universe, but they've just developed a deeper understanding of those laws, and they're able to use that understanding to their advantage.
Yeah, it's like they've learned the code.
Right.
They know how the system works, so they're
Yeah.
able to work within the system to create the outcomes they desire.
Right, right. So even though this principle of cause and effect is operating on all levels, there's this idea that you can actually, use your understanding of the higher laws to overcome the lower laws in a way.
Yeah, and I think that brings us back to that idea that there's no such thing as chance.
Right.
That everything happens according to law. And so when we understand those laws, when we understand how the universe works, we can actually start to take more control over our lives.
Right, right. So to wrap things up for today, I think the key takeaway here is that the universe is not random. Yeah.
It's governed by laws. And when we understand those laws,
Mm-hmm.
we can actually start to shape our own experiences in a more conscious and deliberate way.
It's really about going from being reactive to being proactive, from being an
Yeah.
effect to being a cause.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, as a final thought for you to ponder, I would encourage you to think about an area of your life right now where you feel like you're more of an effect than a cause.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's your career, your relationships, your health, whatever it might be. And just ask yourself, what are some of the root causes that might be contributing to that situation?
Yeah.
And then, what's one small step you can take
Mhm.
to start exploring those causes and to start shifting the balance?
Yeah.
To start becoming more of a cause in that area of your life. Because I think that's where true freedom lies.
Yeah.
When we understand the laws of the universe and we can actually start to work with them.
It's a journey. It's not a destination.
It's about constantly learning and applying and refining your understanding.
Yeah. So we encourage you to keep reflecting on this principle and see how it shows up in your life. And, we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks for joining us.